In the summer of 2014, I was in Iraqi Kurdistan with a small team of archaeologists finishing a season of field excavations near the border town of Halabja. Our project was looking into something which has puzzled and intrigued me ever since I began studying archaeology. We're taught to believe that thousands of years ago, when our ancestors first invented agriculture in that part of the world, that it set in motion a chain of consequences that would shape our modern world in a particular direction, on a particular course. By farming wheat, our ancestors supposedly developed new attachments to the land they lived on. Private property was invented, and with that, the need to defend it. Along with new opportunities for some people to accumulate surpluses, came new labor demands, tying most people to a hard regime of tending their crops, while a privileged few received the freedom and the leisure to do other things, to think, to experiment, to create the foundations of what we refer to as civilization. Now, according to this familiar story, what happened next is that populations boomed, villages turned into towns, towns became cities, and with the emergence of cities, our species was locked on a familiar trajectory of development where spiraling populations and technological change were bound up with the kind of dreadful inequalities that we see around us today. Except, as anyone can tell you who's looked at the evidence from the Middle East, almost nothing of what I've just been saying is actually true. And the consequences, I'm going to suggest, are quite profound. Actually, what happened after the invention of agriculture around 10,000 years ago is a long period of around are quite profound. Actually, what happened after the invention of agriculture around 10,000 years ago is a long period of around another 4,000 years in which villages largely remained villages. And actually, there's very little evidence for the emergence of rigid social classes, which is not to say that nothing happened. Over those 4,000 years, technological change actually proceeded apace. Without kings, without bureaucracies, without standing armies, these early farming populations fostered the development of mathematical knowledge, advanced metallurgy. They learned to cultivate olives, vines, and date palms. They invented leavened bread, beer, and they developed textile technologies, the potter's wheel, the sail. And they spread all of these innovations far and wide, from the shores of the Eastern Mediterranean up to the Black Sea, and from the Persian Gulf all the way over to the mountains of Kurdistan, where our excavations were taking place. I've often referred half-jokingly to this long period of human history as the era of the first global village. Because it's not just the technological innovations that are so remarkable, but also the social innovations which enabled people to do all these things without forming centers and without raising up a class of permanent leaders over everybody else. Now, oddly enough, this efflorescence of culture is not what we usually refer to as civilization. Instead, that term is usually reserved for harshly unequal societies which came thousands of years later: dynastic Mesopotamia, pharaonic Egypt, imperial Rome, societies that were deeply stratified. So, in short, I've always felt that there was basically something very weird about our concept of civilization, something that leaves us lost for words, tongue-tied, when we're confronted with thousands of years of human beings, say, practicing agriculture, creating new technologies, but not lording it over each other or exploiting each other to the maximum. Why don't we have better words? Where is our lexicon for those long expanses of human history in which we weren't behaving that way? Over the past 10 years or more, I worked closely together with the late, great anthropologist David Graeber to address some of these questions. But we did it on a much larger scale because from our perspective as an archaeologist and an anthropologist, this clash between theory and data, between the standard narrative of human history and the evidence that we have before us today, is not just confined to the early Middle East. It's everything. Our whole picture of human history that we've been telling for centuries is basically wrong. Just to write about even very remote periods of history that we have evidence for, as if there were real people in them. Which sounds like a ridiculous thing to say, but it's very rarely done. You know, prehistoric people are more likely to be compared to non-human primates than they are to people like you or I.
What if everything we knew about human history was wrong? Received wisdom is that humans have been around for 2, maybe 300,000 years, but that we only start agriculture in the last 10 to 12,000. After that, we have cities, astronomy, numbers, civilization as we know it. But according to a book by David Wengrow and the recently deceased David Graeber, that's not quite accurate. They say that cities and what we judge as advanced human culture actually precedes agriculture, that the story of prehistory is far more complex and interesting than we thought, and that this has quite remarkable political implications. David Wengrow, welcome to Downstream.
Thanks for having me on.
You're an archaeologist. You teach archaeology at University College London. Is that a job you always wanted to do when you were a child?
And all the and I after actually gets you hooked and gives you the confidence to think, yes, you have about 6 months. But I have one teacher. It was one of those things where it's just one person actually gets you hooked and gives you the confidence to think, yes, you have a place in this, you can contribute. And that was a guy called Andrew Sherratt, who passed away very young, actually, same age as David, 59. Just had a massive heart attack one day. But really sort of got me to pull my finger out and got me addicted to this stuff. And I didn't really look back after that.
Because it's something you hear all the time, I'm sure, that at some point most people, when they're children, want to be archaeologists.
Yeah. I did have, I mean, there's obviously something there. I can remember a school trip to Old Sarum, just on Salisbury Plain. It's one of these great Iron Age hill forts. And it's not like a unusually high dosage.
200, 300,000 years. You can give humans have been around for 200, 300,000 years. You can give the specific numbers in the answer. But we've only engaged in agriculture for 12,000 years, 11,000 years, 12,000 years. And that with the advent of agriculture, we then get all the things that we associate with modern humans. Cities, numbers, numeracy, literacy, astronomy, civilization. Your book, co-written with the recently departed David Graeber, says that's completely wrong. Or it's significantly wrong.
Well, we'd have to pick apart what you said there a bit, Aaron. When you say we started having agriculture 12,000 years ago, only a very tiny number of people on the planet started doing that in very specific locations. Specifically the Middle East, what they sometimes call the Fertile Crescent. Most of the world at that time was still hunter-gatherers and fishers. So, actually what you've presented as a summary is a classic example of what we would call a kind of stage theory, where you've got these long periods when sort of nothing happens. then everything changes. You get the agricultural revolution, populations expand. Then you get cities, and everything changes again. Then you get civilization. And one of the things we try to show in the book is that actually the process is much more interesting than that. And you've got people at what are supposed to be different phases or stages of history actually living cheek by jowl, sort of feeding off each other, reacting against each other, and also consciously planning and designing societies according to different sets of values, which, you know, when we talk about civilization and modernity, there's this deeply ingrained assumption to think that it's only us moderns, or supposedly moderns, you know, us post-Enlightenment folk, who've been able to do that, to actually make a decision about the kinds of societies we wish to live in, and then consciously try to make that happen. And I think that's a deeply rooted idea, both in the intellectual, philosophical, and political traditions of the left and of the right in Europe, in the European tradition, let's say. And we think that's wrong. And as you say, humans have been around, as far as we know. Humans who are cognitively just like you and I, same kinds of brains, perfectly capable of having a conversation just like the one that we're having, for something in the order of 200 to 300,000 years. And what we know about most of that time is vanishingly little. But if you think about it, that's extraordinary. I mean, the number of things that could have happened, the number of different kinds of conversations and experiments that could have taken place. And yet, the way we tend to write about and characterize those early periods is the opposite. It's as if people were existing in some sort of strange haze, just kind of, following patterns or routines until one day somebody invents agriculture and everything changes. And that's the kind of, I guess, conceptual damage that we do to our own past. The dawn of everything is trying to undo. Just to write about even very remote periods of history that we have evidence for, as if there were real people in them, which sounds like a ridiculous thing to say, but it's very rarely done. You know, prehistoric people are more likely to be compared to non-human primates than they are to people like you or I.
And I love this insight which you have, which I'd never ever thought of before. Maybe we can go into it a little bit, about foragers, hunter-gatherers being less parochial, basically, than modern humans. I mean, maybe not today in the age of the internet, but until relatively recently.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little?
This is one of the great revelations of modern archaeology, is, you know, this whole idea that humans before agriculture lived in these tiny bands, sort of isolated pockets of humanity, nomadic, roaming around the landscape, not having much contact, is completely wrong. Like, we can trace back now, in concrete terms, evidence going back tens and tens of thousands of years before agriculture to show evidence going back tens and tens of thousands of years before agriculture.
And made, and there were other, and in evolutionary terms, rather recently. And in evolutionary terms, and just before I start, I wanted to remind you about what I think almost everyone knows, and that is that the origin of modern humans, of the ancestors of everyone alive today on the planet, is in Africa, and in evolutionary terms, rather recently. in the something like 200 to 400,000 years ago. And then modern humans start spreading out of Africa and the Middle East seriously something like less than 100,000 years ago, maybe more around 70,000 years ago. But the interesting thing to us is that at that time they were not alone on the planet. There were other forms of humans around. Most famously, perhaps, in Western Eurasia, the Neanderthals, but in Eastern Eurasia, other forms of humans that we will mention in just a few minutes. So our research group has been obsessed, if you like, with Neanderthals.
So for those of you who've been to my previous lectures in this series, we've been talking a lot about the kind of fundamentals of evolution. So what is evolution? What are mutations? What is the role of chance in evolution? Tonight, we're going to change direction and become much more personal and think only about evolution in the context of ourselves. And in particular, the question that I want to ask, and I'm going to give you a spoiler alert, I'm not going to answer it. The question I'm going to ask is, why are we alone on the planet? Why are we the only species of human? And I think if you think about that at sort of, very glancing moment, you might think that's a completely trivial question, but actually it's not that trivial. And for those of you who are, perhaps fans of science fiction, there are lots of great science fiction movies where you see, your hero go into a bar and there are all these different species at the bar, all chatting away in multiple languages and ordering drinks. And actually, if you look around the world, there are lots of instances when very, very similar species live cheek by jowl. But as far as I can tell tonight, at least in this room, if I look around the room, I think we are all human. No one's sort of interloping from a different species here. And it's not, though, inconceivable to have a sort of parallel planet in which we were a mixed species, right? I could be giving this talk in multiple languages to multiple different species, all bipedal, relatively intelligent, ape-like organisms, and interacting together. But we don't live like that. So there is something that has happened to make humans the only human species on the planet. And we don't know the answer to why, but what I want to do tonight is think a little bit about how we got here, and maybe speculate a bit about the factors that might have driven that evolution, and perhaps even going forwards, think a little bit about where we might go from here. So before we think about why we're the only species, it's quite important to think about what a species is anyway, and that's not actually a very straightforward question to answer. There are several definitions of what a species is out there, but perhaps the one that is most widely used and most kind of functional is the one proposed by Ernst Mayr, who you see here, which is known as the biological species concept, which in essence says that a species is a group of individuals that reproduce successfully together. And it's important to say successfully. So this is not just about an ability to reproduce, but an ability to do so in a way that maintains the species. So if most of your offspring die, for example, then actually that's not a successful reproduction. You have to be able to reproduce successfully. And that group is reproductively isolated from other such groups. So in other words, you're not breeding with other species, you are distinct entities. And as we'll see later in the lecture, that actually is quite a tricky thing to define and quite problematic, particularly in the case of humans. But nonetheless, I think it's probably still the best example or the best definition we have of species. And by that definition, then Homo sapiens, our own species, is indeed both of those things. We can all reproduce together, and there aren't other species with which we reproduce.
The Gresham College lecture that you're listening to right now is already...
But why, in its own right, raises an interesting question. And the question essentially is not why we're only one species, but why don't we have another sibling species that looks a lot like us on the planet? Because lots and lots of animals and plants do. So, for example, if you're a lepidopterist, if you're keen on butterflies, you'll be familiar with these chaps. These are the Heliconius butterflies, and they're a complete nightmare because they all look the same, but they're actually many, many different species. In fact, in this particular diagram, each pairwise comparison are two different species. And I don't know to you, but certainly to me, it's very difficult to tell those apart, and yet they are distinct. So there are lots of sister species in this genus. And the same holds true for lots of other animals. So I'm a bit of a birder, not a very good one, and definitely not good enough to tell these apart. This is the Clark's and western grebe, or possibly the Clark's and western grebe, depending on which way around they are. And these are two distinct species of bird, and yet they are almost impossible to tell apart in the field. And in fact, these are a North American species, but closer to home, for example, in the UK, we have the marsh tit and the willow tit, and you've got to be a pretty advanced ornithologist to be able to spot the difference between those two species in the field. So there are lots and lots of examples of species that are very similar, living relatively close to each other. And yet we don't go down the road and pop into the supermarket and see something that looks like a bipedal, hairless, intelligent ape, but isn't actually a human. We are, as far as we know, alone. Or are we? I mean, the first question, perhaps, is might we have missed something? And one of the things that people occasionally speculate about in the press is maybe we have missed another related species of human. And actually, that's not completely impossible to think about, because even today, in the 21st century, in this very developed kind of world in which we live, there are large areas of essentially unexplored wilderness. So in fact, in this estimate from 2018, almost a quarter of the world's land surface is still classed as wilderness, i.e. it has relatively little human habitation or human activity. Shown here. So it's perhaps possible that you have some other species living in these wilderness areas, although, of course, even wilderness areas are visited relatively frequently by tourists or explorers or mountaineers or whatever. So it seems a bit unlikely that you'd have large populations of another human living in those locations. There are some parts of the world, of course, that are completely unexplored, and by recent estimates, it's about 2 or 3% of the world's land surface has genuinely not had humans access it. And so there, of course, you may have some other species hiding out. The problem is that 2 or 3% of unexplored world are largely things like remote mountaintops, the middle of Antarctica, places that are not compatible with human life, or at least human life as we know it now. It's possible, of course, that there's some species that can live in the middle of Antarctica and is happily roaming around there and we don't know about them, but they would look quite different to modern humans. I think it's fairly unlikely that they exist. Never say never, but I'm going to place some decent money that there probably isn't a second species of human that we haven't discovered yet. So what about the second possibility? Maybe there is a second species lurking right under our noses. And actually, if you were an alien zoomed down onto this planet and you looked at the fantastic diversity of humans on it, you might reasonably think this is not one species, right? We come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes and colors and cultures and societies and family structures, and we do all sorts of different things that I think if you were looking at it in another species, you might reasonably think represented different groups of people. And this, of course, was something that early explorers, European explorers in particular, floated as ideas. And in fact, even quite late into our kind of exploration of the world, people were speculating on this. So this, for example, is a picture of Charles Darwin arriving in South America on his voyage on the Beagle. And when he arrived there, in his diary, he noted many, many interesting interactions. One in particular with the native population of Tierra del Fuego, the Fuegians. And in his diary at the time, he noted this. He said, viewing such men, one can hardly make oneself believe that they are fellow creatures and inhabitants of the same world. This was obviously relatively late. This is well into the 1800s. Prior to that, European explorers had met native indigenous populations in many countries and had repeatedly come up with this suggestion that maybe these were distinct. And this, of course, this pseudo-scientific idea was the horrendous justification used for real tragedies like enslavement of people in Africa and the eradication of Native American populations in a deliberate genocide by Europeans. The point about all this, though, is that it is completely untrue. We know, and we knew actually from the very beginning, the very first interactions of Europeans with native populations elsewhere, that we are one species. Either through coercive or sometimes consensual relations, we knew that people could have perfectly successful children together. And actually, one of the great revelations of whole genome sequencing today is that many of us, perhaps even in this room, realize that we have a very interesting blend of genetics from all sorts of populations in the past. Because, as we now know, all humans all around the world are one species and able to reproduce together. So we're not overlooking some secret second species within our own group. So neither do we have a hidden species somewhere else, nor are we overlooking something here. There is a third possibility, and the third possibility is maybe we're overlooking a sister species that we talk about all the time. So we are, as you well know, hopefully, are great apes, and along with the other families of species in the great apes, we all share many characteristics, and our closest relations, as I'm sure you know, are the chimpanzees and bonobos. So perhaps I'm standing here saying we're alone as a species, and I'm talking nonsense, because maybe these are our sister species, and that's a possibility. They look a little bit different to us. They're much hairier for starters, but actually they're very, very similar. And in fact, by genetic data, we know that we share something like 98% of our genome with chimpanzees. That's pretty high, and so perhaps chimpanzees are actually a sister species to humanity. However, if you look at that level of genetic preservation, within humans, the amount is much, much more consistent. So typical, in a room like this, a typical human-to-human comparison shows 99.9% DNA identity, and even the most diverse humans still share something like 99.6%. So the differences between any two humans in terms of genetics are an order of magnitude smaller than the differences between ourselves and chimpanzees. Perhaps more importantly, chimpanzees, of course, have a sister species, bonobos, and if you look at those, the genetic distance between them is about 0.4%. In other words, the difference between a chimpanzee and a bonobo is about the same as the difference between a human and a quite different human from the same species. So these two are indeed sibling species, but they are not a direct sibling species to human. The distance is much higher. So it doesn't matter which way you look at it, whichever way we bore this question, it does indeed appear that we are on our own. We are the only species of Homo, the genus that we're in, that is currently on the planet. So then, maybe there's not a problem here, because maybe actually we have always been alone. Perhaps Homo came into existence, and we have been a solitary species essentially for all of our history. And this question, or this suggestion, I guess, was not problematic for most of human history. Because, of course, for most of human history, certainly in Western Europe at least, the predominant rhetoric has been one of biblical creation. So the idea that humans were created as a species to have domination over all other species. So it would make sense. Humans' rhetoric has been one of biblical creation. and we have been a solitary species essentially for all of our history. And this question, or this suggestion, I guess, was not problematic for most of human history. Because, of course, for most of human history, certainly in Western Europe at least, the predominant rhetoric has been one of biblical creation. So the idea that humans were created as a species to have domination over all other species. So it would make sense in that particular view that we were alone. Because if you're going to create a species to dominate all the other ones, you probably wouldn't create two, because that's going to be problematic. And so up until sort of the 1700s, this was not a particular issue. However, as Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection took hold and people started to really understand this principle, they began to question more and more this idea about why humans should be so different to everything else. If species arise by natural selection, by diversification, then why should human species be anything different to anybody else? Why haven't we diversified? Why don't we have these sibling species? And this problem, I guess, was kind of rumbling around, particularly in the more learned, more kind of liberal Victorian society, at least in England at the time, and across actually many of the learned cities of Europe in particular. And people started to ask questions about some of the artifacts that had previously been reported, particularly from mining expeditions. And so actually for many decades, people quarrying for stone for buildings, for example, had occasionally stumbled across weird and wonderful things that we would now call fossils or archival material. Sometimes these were animals, often they were animals, but frequently they came across things that looked pretty human. For example, like this skull dug out of a quarry in Gibraltar in the early 1800s. When they'd done that, these were typically described, by the scientific community at least, as archaic humans. So they were humans that had been around for a long time. There was also a sort of interesting and slightly amusing and quite disturbing in some ways sort of trade, if you like, in these things were associated with crazy myths. So people say, oh, they're extinct giants, or they were kind of mythological 12-headed beasts or something. And there was a kind of roaring circus trade in demonstrating bits of scary monsters that came out of quarries. However, now we know scientifically that was not true. So these things had been found for a period of time, but had always been attributed to Homo sapiens. So people would say these are old, archaic, long-dead humans. And then in 1856, this part of skull was found in Germany, in the Neander Valley, and was successfully identified by a German school teacher, actually, as being distinct enough from Homo sapiens to be a different species. And this is the species that we now know as Neanderthals. And once as being distinct enough from Homo sapiens, found in Germany in the Neander Valley, 1956, this part of skull was found in Germany in the Neander Valley, and was successfully identified by a German school teacher, actually, as being distinct enough from Homo sapiens to be a different species. And this is the species that we now know as Neanderthals.
And you may then ask, why should we be so interested in this extinct form of humans that you see to the left here, compared to a modern human on the right? And for me, there are at least two reasons for that. One is that Neanderthals and Asian forms, relatives of Neanderthals, are the closest evolutionary relatives to all people living today. So if we want to define modern humans, define ourselves from a biological or genetic perspective as a group, it's the Neanderthals we should compare ourselves to and see in what sense are we different from them, in what sense are we similar to them.
And once that view had been promoted, that this was a different lineage of humanity, people went back and looked at other material, including this skull from Gibraltar, and realized that this skull was actually much more similar to this new Neanderthal skull than to modern humans. And so actually much of the fossil material that had previously been identified was now realized to be Neanderthal material rather than human material. And so this, which is also going on in the context at the same time, for example, as Darwin was publishing his book on the origin of species, was kind of entering this sort of very intellectual debate around diversification and about evolution of humans. It still, though, didn't really change our view about humans being a kind of solitary species in existence. However, in 1891, this rather dashing chap here with the nice moustache, Eugène Dubois, who was a Dutch anatomist, was working in what was then the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia. And he was particularly interested in some of the remains being found in caves as people pushed on up. And it was then the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia. And he was particularly interested in some of the remains being found in caves as people pushed on up, and particularly the logging industry, as they started to roam into the rainforest, would come across sometimes caves with bone remnants. He started to collect some of these and classify them together, and realized that one collection of skeletal material belonged to something that looked very human-like. He actually misidentified this and thought this was an extinct species of great ape, gave it a different name and published it. But people, once it was sent back to Europe, did not agree with this and relatively rapidly realized that this was a second example of a distinct species of now extinct human-like organism. So within the genus Homo, and this is what we now know of as Homo erectus, a long extinct ancestor of modern humans, and for which there's now fossil material from many other locations around the world. So now, as we start to turn into the end of the 1800s, we have a position where there are at least two species of Homo, so Neanderthalis and what is now Homo erectus, that we think have existed and no longer do exist. So the world is starting to view the fact that we perhaps haven't always been alone through quite a different lens. And then this third piece of the puzzle, if you like, comes around in 1907 with this chap with the even more dashing facial hair. The beards get longer all the time, I think. This is Otto Schouten-Sack. And he was a German industrialist, and I really like this story because he was actually, as a relatively young man, he was a chemist, and he set up factories producing chemicals, essentially, and made an awful lot of money. He was essentially an industrial entrepreneur. And rather than buying himself a, fancy yacht or something and sailing around the world, he decided to invest his money in a proper education. He went back to university and studied what was then known as a degree in prehistory, what we would now call anthropology or something like that, and used his money to fund investigations into the evolution of humans. And in particular, what he would do was offer a reward to people who were working in quarries in Germany. If they came up with any interesting material, they would bring it to him and he would pay them for it. And in 1907, the Mauer quarry, someone came to Otto with this rather spectacular jawbone. And also in his newly found life as a paleontologist, correctly identified this as another species of Homo and another extinct one. This is what we now know of as Homo heidelbergensis, named by him. And at the time was the first really well accepted totally distinct species of human. Since 1907, we've obviously had a massive explosion in the activities, particularly in the last 20 or 30 years, actually, in the discovery of both fossil material and artifacts associated with humans. And this is an incredibly fast-moving field. So actually, in the time I've been talking to you, I'm sure someone's going to say I'm completely wrong. So to avoid you all pinning the blame on me, I've lifted this rather nice diagram from the Natural History Museum, so you can blame them for it being out of date instead. We now know that there are many, many species of now extinct Homo that have existed and have existed in parallel. So, for example, here in this top corner, you can see at least 4 or 5 species that have been present on the planet at the same time for a large period of our history, but are no longer present with us today. Today, as far as we know, as I said, Homo sapiens is the only one of these to still be present. So why might that be? What has happened to drive this colonization of Homo sapiens around the world and to remove these other species? Why is it that we don't go to the supermarket and bump into a Homo heidelbergensis? And to think about that in a bit more detail, we have to think about what our most recent parallel species were like and why, therefore, they may no longer be around now. So, as far as we know at the moment, and as I say, this is undoubtedly subject to change, and I suspect very soon we'll have to revise this lecture, but as we know at the moment, there are at least 4 parallel species of Homo-like organisms, so like ourselves, that have coexisted in relatively recent evolutionary history. And by relatively recent, I mean the last 100,000 years or so. There are cells. This is Homo sapiens, and looks like a very familiar skeleton. And then the species about which we know the most, by far, are these chaps, the Neanderthals. In many ways, very, very similar. Skeleton looks very similar, same sorts of bones. Much chunkier. You can see already that the bones are thicker, that the whole body is more well developed. And some subtle differences, particularly around the skull. And the example I like the best is that people say you can tell whether you're a Neanderthal or a Homo sapiens by standing in the rain. So if you're out standing in the rain, and the rain is forming a nice sheet in front of your eyes because it's dripping off your brow ridge, then you're probably a Neanderthal, and you should check in the mirror. If it's running down your face and dripping off your chin, then you're probably a Homo sapiens, and you can go home safe in the knowledge you're the correct species. Because Neanderthals had a very prominent brow ridge and a receding chin, we have a negligible brow ridge and a protruding chin. So you can check your chin now in the audience if you want to make sure you are the correct species, and if not, please come to see me afterwards, because it really ruins the lecture if you're a Neanderthal. So we know a lot about the Neanderthals. We have a lot of fossil material, and we have a lot of associated artifacts with their life. And as I'll show you in a minute, we also have genetic information.
And another interesting thing is that the Neanderthals and their relatives were here quite recently, just until 1200, 1400 generations ago. So an interesting question is how we are related to them, what happened when our ancestors met them, and so on. But to then address these questions from a genetic perspective, what you need to do is to retrieve DNA, retrieve genomes from remains of individuals that died at least 40,000 years ago when the last Neanderthals disappeared. And that is what our laboratory has then worked on since about 35 years by now. And this started out by studying ancient Egyptian mummies that look very well preserved when you look at them with your eye. What one could show already back in the 80s then was that if you look in the microscope on tissues from such mummies, you can sometimes see that there are preservation of something that looks like cell nuclei in the, let me see here, in the basal levels of the skin, for example, here. And you can also stain those nuclei for DNA and show that DNA is preserved there. So back at the time, I got very excited and cloned some of that DNA in bacteria, sequenced some of it, and found that some of this DNA was human, and I published that to great fanfare. But what then turned out over the next 2 years is that those first sequences were clearly not from the mummy. It was human DNA, but they were rather long pieces that clearly came from probably a museum curator or an archaeologist who had handled the specimen. It's a long, nice piece. DNA. It's present in a large extent, many amounts of dust particle in the air in this room can totally overwhelm your experiments. Many contamination cases of are then particularly complete genomes from extinct forms of humans, such as Neanderthals. And what you then do is that you have these short modified molecules that you sequence, and you then match them to the human genome and see where they come from. And if you have enough of them, you can actually reconstruct large parts of the human genomes, all parts of the genome that exist in a single copy that is not repeated. And today we have then high-quality genomes of at least 3 Neanderthals that have been published. We have a few more that we're going to publish very soon that are of a quality similar to a genome we would sequence from a present-day person. And when you compare these genomes to the genomes of present-day people, to modern humans, you find something quite interesting. So here is just for one chromosome, and each line is one present-day chromosome, and in red is marked segments of these chromosomes in present-day people that are identical or almost identical to Neanderthals. So you see that almost everyone in this example on chromosome 9 carries some segments that are very close to the Neanderthals. And that adds up then on average to about 2% of the genomes of people living in Asia or in Europe. And as you can also see, different people contain different segments here. So you can jump from individual to individual and reconstruct in blue here longer parts of the Neanderthal genome in people who walk around today. And that adds up to almost half of the Neanderthal genome that still exists. And the reason for this, of course, is that our ancestors, when they met Neanderthals, mixed with them from individual to individual and reconstruct in blue here longer parts of the Neanderthal genome in people who walk around today. And that adds up to almost half of the Neanderthal genome that still exists. And that adds up to almost half of the Neanderthal genome that still exists today. And that adds up to almost half of the Neanderthal genome that still exists. And the reason for this, of course, is that our ancestors, when they met Neanderthals, mixed with them. And that the babies that then came from these unions contributed to the ancestry of present-day people. And we find this contribution from Neanderthals when we look in everybody whose roots are outside Africa today. So anyone whose roots are in Northern Africa, in Europe, or in Asia, or in the Americas, or Australia, have 1 or 2% of their DNA from Neanderthals. And we think the reason for that is that modern humans, when they came out of Africa, met Neanderthals.
Many tens
elections, briefing visitors who come from all over the world, and organizing programs, symposia, and workshops.
Be invited here to speak in front of you at the Library of Congress. Thank you very much to Mary Jane and to Roberta and to Levon for having me here. For those with the history and the geography of Armenians, this map shows you the various areas in which Armenians lived. In yellow is the current Republic of Armenia. In dotted black, you see the region which is considered historical, the area in which historical Armenians lived over the years. You have on the side the Armenian kingdom of Cilicia, which existed for about 300 years after the fall of Ani. And in light brown is the farthest reach of an Armenian empire at the time of Tigran the Great, but it didn't last very long. It was in 70 BC. This gives you an idea of the geographical area we're talking about here. Interesting to study is that they didn't really mix too much with other people once they became Armenian. And I think personally that a lot of it has to do with the geography. Bounded by the Caucasus Mountains to the north, the Pontic Mountains south of the Black Sea, the Taurus Mountains and the Zagros Mountains. So it's a relatively hostile geography. A lot of people went through it, but few people seem to have stayed there. Geography. A lot of people went through it, but few people seem to have stayed there. Geography. A lot of people went through it, but few people seem to have stayed there. So I think the geography has an important impact on Armenian DNA, including the Armenian plateau and the broad area. When we talk about the cultures which were present in the broad area, including the Armenian plateau, and some of these cultures reach far to the north, into the steppes of Russia, over the Caucasus Mountains. You have a list here of all the different cultures over the Caucasus Mountains.
Quite early on and mixed with them, and then carried that contribution with them out to the rest of the world. But we have also found something more interesting almost, and that is at this site in southern Siberia, Denisova Cave, where the Russian archaeologists who excavate the site and collaborate with us have found a tiny little bone that they were very skilled to realize might come from a human. And when we studied the genome of this little bone, we were very surprised to find that it was not a modern human, it was not a Neanderthal, but it was something else that go quite far back, sharing a common ancestor with Neanderthal, something like 400,000 years back. So it was found in the Denisova Cave. So after much deliberation, we sort of named this group of humans that is then defined only from their genome sequence as Denisovans, since they were first found then at Denisova Cave. And you can then ask, have they also contributed to people who live today? And the answer is yes. We find a contribution from them wherever we look in Asia. Where in mainland Asia, something like 0.2% or so, a tiny fraction, but a detectable fraction of the genome come from Denisovans. If you look in Oceania, in Aboriginal Australians, or in Papua New Guinea, for example, up to 5% of the genomes of people there come from Denisovans. So if I should just summarize the first part here then, which is about what we think we know about the origins of Denisovans and Neanderthals and modern humans from studying genomes, then Denisovans and Neanderthals have some origin in Africa, quite far back, and they then leave somewhere 500,000 years ago. Denisovans and Neanderthals have some origin in Africa, quite far back, and they then leave somewhere 500,000 years ago, leave Africa, and in Western Eurasia they evolved to what we call Neanderthals, and in Eastern Eurasia to what we call Denisovans. And we don't quite know where the border between these groups were. It varied over time. But for example, in southern Siberia there have been Denisovans at some times and Neanderthals at other times. And sometimes you can even show that they have met because they have also mixed with each other and had children together. Then modern humans evolve in Africa, as we said, and start spreading out of Africa 50, 70,000 years ago. And they then meet first Neanderthals in the Near East and mix with them early on. They continue to spread, and we are learning now that they mixed several times with Neanderthals. And in the East, they meet Denisovans, mix with them, also several times. There are several populations of Denisovans that we can detect that have contributed. For example, different Denisovan populations have contributed in Japan and in Papua New Guinea to present-day people. Then modern humans spread to many other parts of the world, and these earlier forms of humans disappear.
Then we have this little chap here. This is Homo floresiensis. We know far less about this species for two reasons, really. First of all, it was only discovered in 2003. And second of all, we have only found it on the island of Flores in Indonesia and nowhere else. And people with good memories might remember the kind of media flurry around this. It's often referred to as the Hobbit, because as you can see from this, it's very small. In fact, Homo floresiensis probably topped out at about 1 meter tall, so about here, something like that. It was a very diminutive species of Homo, and people actually argue still a lot about where it fits. It has some characteristics that look very ancestral, much more like some human precursors, if you like, that were living perhaps 6 million years ago. But in other features, it looks relatively modern, much more like Homo sapiens, and it's a little bit unclear about the lineage of this. There's also relatively little fossil material from this species, and there have been some difficulties in studying it, and so the position of floresiensis in the kind of family tree is debated. However, the dating is pretty good, so we know that this chap was running around on the island of Flores at the time that modern Homo sapiens was elsewhere in the world. So it's certainly contemporary in time, even if it wasn't contemporary in geography. And then the fourth and final species that we know we have shared our planet with relatively recently is significantly unspectacular as a fossil, because here it is. These are the Denisovans, and the Denisovans are a quite mysterious species living in Asia, in Siberia, in what is now Russia, essentially. And to date, this is pretty much the full extent of all the fossil material that we have. A little bit of arm or leg bone, a little bit of jawbone, and a few teeth, from multiple individuals, though. So it's quite hard to reconstruct this. All the data we have suggests that they were probably similar in kind of physiology to you and I. So they were not very small, for example, like the Flores species. We know from dating that they were definitely around at the same time as Homo sapiens, so they were present at the same time. And we know that they are distinct from both ourselves and from Neanderthals. So we have 4 species, at least, that were cohabiting the planet at the same time. And our best guess is the wrong phrase, our best information so far suggests a story that looks a bit like this. And I'm going to caveat this by saying every time someone discovers new fossil material, all the dates change and a lot of the patterns of migration change. So if you're watching this on catch-up in 6 months' time, it might be completely wrong. Go away and do a Google search and check. But as of today, this is our view. The view is that Around 600,000 years ago, Homo heidelbergensis, you'll remember that's the jawbone that was reported from Germany, was a sort of most recent common ancestor of modern humans, evolving in Africa about 600,000 years ago, and then from its African origins started to migrate out into Europe and ultimately into Asia. Once located in those parts of the world, like species do, and like those of you who were earlier lectures will recall, it started to diversify, and it started to, in the normal process of evolution, accumulate mutations, accumulate phenotypic change, so physical change, and natural selection did its work. The fittest organisms survived, and the unfit ones died out. So, for instance, the environment in Northern Europe, as we know, is quite different to that in Central Africa. Not least, it was a lot colder. And so selection started to act on these, and you ended up with diversification into what we now recognize to be a new species, the Neanderthals. At the same time, these early pioneers over in Asia were also under selective pressure, were also diversifying in a different direction to become what we now recognize as the Denisovans. So those are the three, and then the fourth species I mentioned we know very little about. Here he is down here, Homo floresiensis. We know from the dating that they were present on Flores by about 74,000 years ago. We don't know at all how they got there or where they got there from. So we don't know, for example, whether these are direct descendants of any of these groups, or some kind of parallel evolution, or some kind of very mysterious migration from a different part of the globe. But they were nonetheless there. So had you dropped on the planet, say, 60, 70,000 years ago, and had a bird's eye view, you would have seen these different populations in these different parts of the world. Meanwhile, back in Africa, Heidelbergensis is, of course, not sitting unmoved. Evolution continues to work even if you're in the same place and continues to select for traits that are beneficial. Traits in particular, like increased intellect, the ability to do things like use tools, to coordinate hunting activities, and ultimately to do all the things that makes humans a great success. These selective pressures change the way that Homo heidelbergensis looks, and ultimately leads to the evolution of what we recognize to be a different species, i.e. anatomically modern Homo sapiens, modern humans. And the date for this arisal of early humans has moved many, many times, even in the last few years. We now think that anatomically modern humans were present in parts of Africa by about 300,000 years ago, particularly based on material from what is now Morocco. And that date, again, may move. But certainly, by about this period, we had organisms living in Africa that look very much like ourselves. And just like their preceding species, Heidelbergensis, these humans too started to spread and migrate to different parts of the world, crossing across the Middle East into Europe and then into Asia. And when they did that, of course, they realized they arrived in a place where there was already a human-like species. So in particular in Europe, there's clear evidence of anatomically modern Homo sapiens entering Europe and meeting, essentially, the indigenous Neanderthal population that was there at the time. We have less material to evidence that from Asia, but it's reasonable to expect we had a similar interaction with Denisovans and possibly even down with the Flores individuals in Indonesia. So anatomically modern humans have migrated out of Africa, they've come into these places, they've met all these other species by around 50,000 years ago. And completely by coincidence, each of these other species then goes extinct. That feels a bit like a Just So story. It seems a bit of a coincidence, doesn't it? That modern humans migrate out of Africa, and one by one, everyone who looks like us dies. And in particular, I think, if you think about the recent history of humanity, we don't have a very good track record about interacting with people in their own countries when we get there. If you think about early European settlers in pretty much any other part of the globe, that story did not end well for the people who were already there. So for a very long time, the rhetoric of modern human evolution assumed, really, I think, that the extinction of these indigenous species was a direct result of conflict with modern humans. In other words, we turned up in Europe, we spotted these Neanderthals, thought they were a bit of a pain, and killed them, and took their place. There are two reasons that that is probably not true. The first is that thus far we have no direct evidence of that at all. So, for example, no evidence of Neanderthal skeletons that have wounds inflicted by weapons. First is that thus far we have no direct evidence of that at all. So, for example, no evidence of Neanderthal skeletons that have wounds inflicted by weapons. We have no evidence of mass genocide. We have nothing like that that might support that argument. And the second piece of evidence I'll tell you in a second, which suggests we might have had a much more positive relationship, at least with some of those species.
But they live on a little bit, so to say, in this 1 to 2% Neanderthal contribution to non-Africans, and up to another 5% or so in Oceania from Denisovans. You may ask, are Africans then different in that they lack this sort of older component in the genome? I think that's probably not the case. We have no ancient genomes yet from Africa, but there are some hints already that when modern humans spread across Africa, they probably also met other forms there and mixed with them, and I think we will learn that in the future. We are beginning to get quite direct evidence for this mixture with Neanderthals. It comes from different sites. I just want to mention the most recent one we studied. It's a site in Bulgaria, Bachukiro. It's quite a fascinating site. Where in this cave site you find in the stratigraphy far down here the very earliest modern humans that come to the area, about 45,000 years ago. Higher up, about 10,000 years later, there are other modern humans that come there. And we've been able to retrieve genomes from 3 individuals down here and 1 up here. And if we look at those genomes and now depict the chromosomes here and mark in blue fragments that come from Neanderthals, we find that these early modern humans have something like 3 or 4% contribution from Neanderthals, so more than people who live today. And they are in big, big chunks. Sometimes almost whole arms of chromosomes come from Neanderthals. So that then shows that they had Neanderthal ancestors quite close in their family tree, something like 4 to 12 generations back. If we then look 10,000 years later in the very same cave on the people who lived there, they look much more like us. They have 2% Neanderthal contribution, and it's in small fragments. So a picture that's emerging is then that the very first modern humans that came to Europe, at least, probably mixed very extensively with Neanderthals. And that the picture that's emerged is that probably it's not that it was some genocide where one killed all the Neanderthals. And that the picture that's emerged is that probably it's not that it was some genocide where one killed all the Neanderthals, but probably Neanderthals and perhaps Denisovans was at least partially simply absorbed into modern human populations.
So we don't actually know why those species all became extinct. There's no evidence that we deliberately eradicated them, but there are certainly several suggestions of things that might have contributed, probably in a combination, to drive these other species to extinction. The first is that this was a period of significant climate challenge, I guess, for these species. So I don't know how well this comes across. So this top graph, the blue graph here, shows average global temperature going from long ago, 800,000 years ago, to modern day here. And what you can just about see, perhaps up here in the top corner, is a long period here between about sort of 150,000 years ago and more recently of extended cold temperatures. So these had two effects. One, the world was colder. Secondly, it was also much drier, because when the world is cold, you lock up a lot of water into ice caps and everything becomes much drier. So one possibility is this very extended period of cold, dry weather presented a significant challenge, particularly to those human-like species that were living in colder parts of the globe. So the Neanderthals in Europe, for example, Denisovans in Siberia, may have struggled to deal with that extended period of cold in a way that perhaps anatomically modern humans did not. There is also evidence at that time for several really large volcanic eruptions, particularly in areas like what is now Italy, and down in the sort of Polynesian area and Indonesian areas, that are likely to have produced a very large quantity of smoke and ash, essentially, which has direct impacts. Obviously, it's not very nice to live in a place where you've got ash falling on you. It's now Italy, and down in the in a way that perhaps anatomically modern humans did not. There is also evidence at that time for several really large volcanic eruptions, particularly in areas like what is now Italy, and down in the sort of Polynesian area and Indonesian areas, that are likely to have produced a very large quantity of smoke and ash, essentially, which has direct impacts. Obviously, it's not very nice to live in a place where you've got ash falling on you, and also indirect impacts in terms of climate change in the local region. Most of the evidence now suggests this on its own is not sufficient to explain extinction, but certainly probably wouldn't have helped the humans living in those areas. A third possibility, and one that's close to my heart, given that I spent most of my life working on infectious diseases, is that maybe this was some kind of horrendous sort of pandemic for these particular species, helped the humans living in those areas. A third possibility, and one that's close to my heart, given that I spent most of my life working on infectious diseases, is that maybe this was some kind of horrendous sort of pandemic for these particular species, perhaps even one that was precipitated by the arrival of modern humans. And if you think about that, for example, when Europeans arrived in the New World, they brought with them, inadvertently at first, deliberately later, smallpox, a disease that was then endemic in Europe, but was not endemic in what is now North America. by the arrival of modern humans. And if you think about that, for example, when Europeans arrived in the New World, they brought with them, inadvertently at first, deliberately later, smallpox, a disease that was then endemic in Europe, but was not endemic in North America. And therefore, Native Americans had almost no resistance to smallpox, and this disease absolutely devastated the Native American population. And this is a pattern that happens a lot. So one possibility is that when modern humans migrated out of Africa, they brought with them perhaps some pathogens to which they were relatively resistant, having co-evolved. But these indigenous populations, never having seen it before, were very susceptible. So maybe they eradicated inadvertently Neanderthals and others by bringing their pathogens with them. A fourth possibility, and one which has had a lot of traction in the press, I think, is about the use of tools. And until fairly recently, this was looking quite compelling, because there was a really good set of data on anatomically modern humans creating really quite elaborate tools and using them to catch and butcher animals, for example, and indeed to do things like make early clothes. And this was not something that was seen with other fossil materials. So the suggestion was maybe we were just technologically superior. We had these amazing tools, and it let us, for example, hunt mammoths and other things. We always got the food, and Neanderthals starved out because they couldn't compete. That has been largely poo-pooed with more recent discoveries of tools that were clearly associated with Neanderthals, and actually the demonstration that Neanderthals could produce equally elaborate tools and indeed had control of things like fire. That has been largely poo-pooed with more recent discoveries of tools that were clearly associated with Neanderthals, and actually the demonstration that Neanderthals could produce equally elaborate tools and indeed had control of things like fire. So actually that technological difference between modern humans and Neanderthals is nowhere near as striking as it first looked, and is probably, again, not enough to explain this. And so the last suggestion that people have made is maybe this is something about the elaborate, intelligent, cultural life that kind of characterizes Homo sapiens. And we know that a key feature of Homo sapiens is their amazing brain capacity and their ability to think about things that are quite abstract. And this is one of my favorite examples. This sculpture called the Lion Man dates back about 40,000 years and was found in Germany. Was produced by anatomically modern humans, we think, and is a really nice example, I think, of the level of sophistication of these primitive, in inverted commas, humans. Because this is a really nice piece of artwork that has been created by somebody that we think of as being sort of very prehistoric. But B, it also demonstrates their ability to think in abstract thoughts, because this is something that does not exist, right? We don't have bipedal lions and never have, as far as we know of. So this is a demonstration of a fusion of ideas. We don't know why they made that. It's been speculated that perhaps it's some kind of religious significance or maybe for some kind of cultural purpose. But nonetheless, the idea that a modern human sitting in the cave somewhere would create something that was a fusion between a human and a lion for some kind of artistic purpose rather than as a practical tool suggests a level of sophistication that we have not yet seen in other species. And so I said at the beginning of the lecture I wasn't going to answer my question, and I'm not, because we don't know the answer. But I guess the most plausible explanation for the extinction of these other species at this stage is some complex combination of a difficult climate and maybe a pathogen and a technological and cultural superiority. For whatever reason, though, by about 38,000 years ago, we were alone. All these other species had died out, and ever since then, as far as we know, Homo sapiens has been the only Homo species on the planet. But to end on a slightly happier note, it's not quite as straightforward as that, because in the last few years, we've learnt that although those other species are extinct, they have left a really exciting remnant. And we have learnt that from the revolution of ancient DNA technologies, particularly driven by Svante Pääbo, a Swedish geneticist who's spent his life really optimizing the ability to retrieve and sequence DNA from very old material, and for which he was awarded the Nobel Prize in 2022. And what Pääbo and others have done is managed to extract DNA from this ancient material and sequence it. And in 2010, which was a dramatic year for this field, they came out with two really impressive findings. The first was they had successfully extracted and sequenced DNA to create a genome, a full genome sequence, from a Neanderthal, which was pretty revolutionary at the time. And then even more revolutionary from that, they had actually, as part of this project, been sequencing different Neanderthal material and realized that one of the pieces of material they were sent was not Neanderthal at all, and in fact was this species I've been talking to you about, the Denisovans. And this is still the first and only example of us discovering a species of Homo by DNA sequencing technology rather than by fossil identification. Once that had been done, people looked at the bone material and realized there were subtle differences, but nonetheless, this was the first discovery of a different species. We now have extensive genome information for both of these species. We do not, sadly, have it for that additional one, the Flores skeleton. That's probably because DNA is not preserved at all well in the tropics, and so there have been attempts but no success in retrieving DNA from that sample from Indonesia, whereas these samples come from much colder climates where the DNA is preserved better. But when we have these genome sequences from these two species, together, of course, with the huge amount of genomic information we have about modern Homo sapiens, we can now do some really interesting comparisons. And the thing that was most striking as soon as this comparison was done was that it shed a huge amount of light on this early diversification and spread of our species. In particular, it validated many of the dates at which Homo sapiens, modern Homo sapiens, had left and moved around Africa. And the reason it did that was because of a pretty remarkable discovery, which is that when you compare those two sequences, those genomic sequences of Neanderthals and Denisovans with modern human genomes, you find that many of us, living humans today, but not all, have bits of those genomes within us.
That were probably much bigger that came, at least later on. But what I then wanted to use most of the time for here is to sort of discuss what this means for us today, this contribution, genetic contribution from these archaic extinct groups from Neanderthals and Denisovans. So what we can then do when we have the genomes from these extinct groups is that we can look on genetic changes that happened on the lineage here, say to Neanderthals, and study the consequences of genetic variants that emerged there and then came into modern humans by this mixing that happened, say, 40, 50,000 years ago. We can then study the biological consequence of those variants by comparing people with and without those variants today. So if you like, we'll use then modern humans as a sort of experimental system to study genetic variants from Neanderthals. And there are several such studies. I just want to mention 2 or 3 here that are particularly medically relevant and topical at the moment, perhaps. So the first example involves progesterone, which you may know is an enzyme, is a hormone that has many functions, but one of them is that is produced from the corpus luteum after ovulation in the ovaries and prepares endometrium in the uterus for a possible pregnancy. And what we are now interested in is a progesterone receptor to which the hormone binds in the target cell and elicits its effects. And there is a genetic variant for the gene encoding this progesterone receptor, and that variant exists outside Africa and not at all or hardly at all in Africa. So this is a very suspicious pattern. When you see this pattern of a variant, it almost always comes from Neanderthals and Denisovans. And so it exists in Europe and Asia, and it's medically quite well known because it is associated with preterm birth. So
in fact, if you're sitting in this room or listening online and you can trace your ancestry unbroken through Africa, only Africa, then you are 100% on average, 100% Homo sapiens genome. If you're like me, if you're a Eurasian, on average, you're about 98% Homo sapiens, but most Eurasians carry about 2% of your genome that you've inherited from Neanderthals. And if you come from this part of the world over here, Polynesia, if you're Melanesian, you have that 2% Neanderthal, and also up to about 4% Denisovan. And that means two really important things. First of all, it means that at a point in relatively recent evolutionary history, modern Homo sapiens did indeed cohabit areas with these two other species, because the second point is, it means we also interbred with them. And in fact, because we are detecting that at such high levels, we probably interbred with them quite a lot, actually. And in fact, you can see this pattern rather beautifully. This is some work fairly recently, just in the last couple of months, actually, looking at the level of Denisovan ancestry in modern humans across the world. And what you see is it's coloured from blue to red. What you see is that if you're from Africa or Europe, you have essentially no Denisovan ancestry on average. And you get more and more and more as you go across until it's peaking here at about 5% down in this part of the world here. And one of the things I quite like about this, actually for people who are familiar with this part of the world, is a thing called Wallace's line. So Alfred Russel Wallace, working at the same time as Darwin, spotted the fact that if you look in this part of the world, the plants and animals on one side of the line are quite different to those on the other side of the line. And that is because over evolutionary time, sea level has gone up and down. And so there have been land bridges that have allowed animals and plants to migrate between these areas. But there's a very deep channel that runs here that has never dried out. And so there's been a barrier, a natural barrier, for a very long time. And so you have a distinct evolutionary history here to here. But that has not affected this climb, this migration of humans, suggesting that humans successfully navigated that stretch of water between these islands, either deliberately on boats or inadvertently by being blown across on rafts of vegetation or something. So this is a really nice piece of data suggesting that modern humans derive from some of these crosses with ancient species. This climb, this migration of humans, suggesting that humans successfully navigated that stretch of water between these islands, either deliberately on boats or inadvertently by being blown across on rafts of vegetation or something. So this is a really nice piece of data suggesting that modern humans derive from some of these crosses with ancient species. And so, in fact, what we now believe is a model that looks a little bit like this. So around between 300 and 200,000 years ago, modern humans evolved in Africa. They migrated out. They met those Neanderthals, as I mentioned before. They didn't eradicate them all in some horrendous genocide. And in fact, they had quite a few romantic interactions with them. We don't, of course, have any information on whether those were coerced interactions or consensual ones, or some mixture of the two. But nonetheless, what we do have is very clear genetic information that they interbred, and that then those hybrids, for want of a better word, those Neanderthal modern human hybrids, migrated further and met this new population, this Denisovan population, and did the same thing again, introducing a new set of genes and migrating further down here, which is why we all have these slightly different ancestries. And I think the most interesting thing about this was the fact that we can see it today suggests this is probably not a very uncommon event, but actually perhaps that modern humans live side by side with these other species for a relatively extended period of time. And the final piece of the puzzle that suggests that's probably really true is this. This is the bone fragment I showed you back a few slides, one of the bone fragments from that cave in Denisova. And I said there was very little sort of fossil material, so bone material, from these individuals. Well, this is one. This is either a leg or an arm, we don't know which, from a Denisovan. And it turned out more recently that the same teams, Van der Parbo's team, have successfully secured DNA from this and sequenced the DNA from this. When they did that, it turns out that this individual was a first-generation hybrid, not between Homo sapiens, but between Denisovans and Neanderthals. Has a one Neanderthal parent and one Denisovan parent. Either we have got unbelievably lucky and found a first-generation hybrid in a sample that is absolutely tiny, or this suggests, and I would suggest that's more likely, this was a very common occurrence. And so you had Homo sapiens and Denisovans and Neanderthals all living close enough and interbreeding that now, thousands of years later, a tiny bone fragment demonstrates a first-generation mixed progeny from one of these matings, suggesting perhaps that we have had this kind of interaction many, many times up until these other species went extinct. And so that suggests that actually our family tree, if you like, is much more complicated than we used to think it was. Rather than this very nice, straightforward branching and everybody else goes extinct and we're here in splendid isolation, instead, we have these frequent interbreeding events between different lineages, some of which then go extinct, but leave their genetic hallmark in modern humans. And in fact, if you're interested, you go into great detail about all the different ancestry around the world and which bits of your genome might have come from different ancient human lineages. It's quite a fascinating dig. And so rather than thinking of human evolution as this kind of biblical pinnacle of success with a single species at the top, we're in fact much more like this really complicated branching tree with lots of cross branches. And perhaps now, for this moment in time, we are on our own as this species. But who knows, roll the clock on another 100,000 years, and we might have all sorts of interesting diversification still coming. And on that note, thank you very much for listening. I'm very happy to take any questions.
So with premature birth, which is of course a risk to the child. So when this was discovered by others, not by us, it was suggested that this must have been a selective disadvantage for Neanderthals, that they had perhaps more premature births. But something that fascinates me that now is becoming possible when we have so many ancient genomes, so not genomes of Neanderthals and Denisovans, but modern human genomes that vary in age from 2,000-3,000 years to about 45,000 years ago, is that we can go over time and follow the frequency of a variant like this and see if it has gone up or down with time. So if we now look at some thousands, something like 3,000 such ancient genomes, so we can now follow in time here, starting 15,000 years ago, going forward in time, and we plot here in black carriers of this progesterone variant from Neanderthals, that's associated with preterm births, in gray people who don't carry it. So we're now starting to go forward in time. I'm trying to start to get this to, maybe I have to stop the laser pointer to get this to move. Is it moving? Well, if I could move forward, you should see, no. If I could move forward, you would see these black dots increasing in frequency somewhere around 5,000-7,000 years ago and become very numerous. Could move forward, you would see these black dots increasing in frequency somewhere around 5,000-7,000 years ago. And become very numerous. So that's not what you would expect for something that is a disadvantage to carry. 7,000 years ago and no. If I could move forward, you would see these black dots increasing in frequency somewhere around 7,000 years ago and become very numerous. So that's not what you would expect for something that is a disadvantage to carry, rather something that's beneficial. So that made us very suspicious. So we went and looked in the biggest cohort study that is easily accessible at the moment, the UK Biobank, where you have some 400,000 individuals, where you have genomic information from their genome, and you have medical information. They have answered questionnaires, and you have their medical records. So we can then see what this variant is associated with there. And we're now looking here in the biobank on the modern variant, so not the Neanderthal variant, the other variant. And then we find that it's associated with bleeding in the biobank on the modern variant, so not the Neanderthal variant, the other variant. And then we find that it's associated with bleeding early in pregnancy. It's associated with miscarriages, the non-variant, and it's negatively associated with numbers of full sisters and also brothers. So actually the modern variant that doesn't come from Neanderthal is associated with miscarriages. So the full story here is that this progesterone receptor, the Neanderthal variant, is associated with premature births, with babies born early, but it's also associated with being protective against miscarriages and resulting in more live births. So we think there is a trade-off here, that you save pregnancies that you would otherwise lose, and the price you pay is that some of these babies are born early. And we're also beginning to understand why this happens, because if you look at the expression of the Neanderthal variant of the receptor, it's more highly expressed than the modern variant. So if you carry this, you have more of the receptor molecules, so you presumably have more of the progesterone receptor effect in the uterus, for example. And very satisfyingly, just over the last 2 years, there have been these 2 big studies showing that if you give progesterone to women who has experienced previous miscarriages, you can substantially decrease the number of miscarriages they have, which fits with this idea that more progesterone effect is beneficial. So that's one example of Neanderthal influence on present-day people. Another one is sadder, if you will. It has to do with this pandemic that we all deal with. As you also know, if you get infected with the viruses, many of us have no symptoms or very few symptoms, and some people become very sick and even die. And you also know that a risk factor for dying from this virus is, for example, old age and some other diseases that you may have. But all these risk factors don't add up, don't allow us to really understand why some people become very, very sick and die, and other people hardly get sick at all from this. So one has also been looking for genetic factors in the hosts that determine how sick you get from the virus. So we're peripherally part of a big international consortium that look for risk factors in our genes. And in 2020, in the early summer, came the first results that were very exciting because they showed one very strong factor on chromosome 3 here that increased your risk of becoming very sick. 20 risk factors in our genes. And in 2020, in the early summer, came the first results that were very exciting because they showed one very strong factor on chromosome 3 here that increased your risk of becoming very sick. And when we then looked there, we were shocked to see that these risk variants, which are here, and these are all the protective variants, are very close to the Neanderthal genomes. So the protective one, or modern variants, if you like, the risk variant is from Neanderthals. So very clearly this risk variant have come over from Neanderthals into modern humans and exist in some modern humans today. And for being a genetic risk, this is quite a substantial risk. So about a year ago, in the clinical picture in Sweden, for example, if you were a carrier, that was when the alpha variant were around, if you were not a carrier of this and ended up being hospitalized, you had about a 7% risk of dying. Whereas if you were a carrier and came to the hospital, you had about a 13% risk of dying, so almost a doubling of your risk. So it's of course very interesting what genes are in this region, what may be responsible for this, and we and many others are trying to study that intensely. There are some good candidates genes in there, but there are unfortunately several good candidates. So it's not so clear what it might be. There are some good ideas. But what we can look at is the frequency of this risk variant around the world. And it is quite frequent. So we can make a sort of average gauge the number of extra deaths we have had in the pandemic due to this contribution from Neanderthals. And it's quite substantial. It's over 1 million extra individuals have died due to this Neanderthal variant. Fortunately, there's several good candidates. So it's not so clear what it might be. There are some good ideas. But what we can look at is the frequency of this risk variant around the world. And it is quite frequent. So we can make a sort of average gauge the number of extra deaths we have had in the pandemic due to this contribution from Neanderthals. And it's quite substantial. It's over 1 million extra individuals have died due to this Neanderthal variant that they carry. So it's a late revenge of the Neanderthals, if you like. But what you can also see is that it's quite interesting frequency distribution of this around the world. So if we look in Japan and China, this variant is absent. It's totally absent here. But if we look in South Asia, it's extremely common in Sri Lanka, Pakistan, India. There's something like 50% of people carry this variant. In Europe, it's more intermediate, like 16%. So very clearly, this variant here must have other functions. It seems to have been negative here and been selected away. One can speculate that maybe coronaviruses have been endemic in this part of the world, so one has lost these variants here, that it has had some positive function in South Asia, for example. And we don't know what those functions are, but we do begin to learn that there are things in this region that are both good and bad. And this is work that comes from Hugo Seberg that works with us and at the Karolinska in Stockholm and is driving for many of these things, coronavirus and other things here that I talk about. So if we look in this region here, the risk region with these candidate genes here, but if you then move on the chromosome about 500,000 base pairs away, there's another gene here called CCR5. Maybe some of you have heard about this gene. It's a co-receptor for HIV, for the virus that gives AIDS. And it's known that if you have a deletion of this gene and don't carry it, you're protected against HIV. But if you then move on the chromosome about 500,000 base pairs away, there's another gene here called CCR5. Maybe some of you have heard about this gene. It's a co-receptor for HIV, for the virus that gives AIDS. And it's known that if you have a deletion of this gene and don't carry it, you're protected against HIV. You don't get infected. So these are carry it, you're protected against HIV. You don't get infected. So these are the rare long-term survivors that are exposed to the virus but don't get the disease. So what Hugo discovered was that if he looks at carriers of the Neanderthal variant, they express less of this CCR5 gene here. So there's something in the Neanderthal piece of DNA here that downregulates CCR5 here. So you have less of this co-receptor for HIV. And indeed, if you look at your risk of contracting HIV, if you carry this variant, it's about 25% less than if you don't carry it. So this variant from Neanderthals on chromosome 3 then is very bad in the current pandemic because it increases your risk to become severely ill if you're infected. But it has beneficial effects too because it decreases your risk of contracting HIV if you're exposed to that virus. So this illustrates, I think, that almost all such variants or genetic variants are at least double-edged swords. They have positive and negative variant functions. And clearly it's something else that caused the absence of this variant here in Japan or in China and the high frequency in India. So it's probably actually a multi-edged sword that have many functions. Before moving on, I just don't want to give Neanderthals just a bad bad reputation in this pandemic. When we now have many more cases and can look for smaller factors in the genome that determine how sick you are, you start finding less strong factors here. And for example, of chromosome 12, you find a variant, a segment that comes from Neanderthals, but in this case, it's actually protective against severe disease. So this is a region here where there are 3 genes called OYS123. One knows actually in this case what these genes do. They sort of induce an enzyme that degrades double-stranded RNAs. It degrades viral genomes that come into the cell. And it's a well-known system, and the variant that comes from Neanderthals make a protein that's a bit longer and sits at the right position in the cell. And it was actually also been shown already that it was protective against SARS-CoV-1 some years ago. So in this case, it's a good influence. And it was actually also been shown already that it was protective against SARS-CoV-1 some years ago. So in this case, it's a good influence from Neanderthals. But unfortunately then the effect size here is a lot smaller, so the risk of on chromosome 3 about doubles your risk to become severely ill. On chromosome 12, the Neanderthal variant decreases it by about 25%. But so these are just a few examples.
So in the talk today, I'm going to tell you about evidence that's really emerged very strongly over the last 8 years, really even the last 4 years, that shows that human population mixture, repeated large-scale mixtures of very different and not so different human populations again and again over time is an important theme of our past. It's not just occurring in the last 500 years when we have many documented cases, for example, in the Americas, but it's occurred thousands of years ago in human. That's really emerged very strongly over the last 8 years, really even the last 4 years, that shows that human population mixture, repeated large-scale mixtures of very different and not so different human populations again and again over time is an important theme of our past. It's not just occurring in the last 500 years when we have many documented cases, for example, in the Americas, but it's occurred thousands of years ago and tens of thousands of years ago and hundreds of thousands of years ago. It's a central theme of our past. So I'm going to begin by introducing we could determine individuals around populations, studying variation, reflect the world. Decades He analyzed blood was that the is the history of farming migration into Europe. We know from the archaeology that farming, which was first invented in the Near East 12 to 11,000 years ago, moved into Europe around 9 or 8,500 years ago and proceeded to spread across the continent. The idea was that these farmers from the Near East would have mixed with the local hunter-gatherers who were already established in Europe, and their ancestry from the Near East would be gradually diluted as they spread west and north across Europe, until today we would have much lower percentages of farmer ancestry in the northwest, much higher in the southeast. But now from ancient DNA, where we can go back and obtain whole DNA sequences from people who lived at the times in question, we now know that the gradient of farmer ancestry is almost exactly perpendicular to what was argued based on the interpretations today. That is, that main gradient of variation is not driven by the farming expansion, but by other things. And the
and I leave it to him to present his work. Okay.
Thank you, Christopher. And it's a great honor to be here to deliver this lecture, the Rice Lecture. I understand the family in third writing Europe. The second take-home message of my lecture here today will be take-home message from my lecture here today will be that we are in the process of rewriting European prehistory, and it will never look the same. The second take-home message is it has never been so fun to be an archaeologist. When I'm finished, I hope you'll understand what I mean. So, what I want to start with here is really just to briefly recapitulate where are we. We are in the middle of the third science revolution in archaeology. At least that's what I've called it, and it's apparently been accepted more generally that we are in the middle of the third science revolution. It has happened since 2010 when we have the breakthrough of next generation sequencing, modern sequencing of full genomes from the past after 25 years without progress. Actually, it took a whole generation of archaeologists to die out before C14 was generally accepted. Because the Stone Age and the Neolithic turned out to be several thousand years older. Now, what was the good thing about it? The good thing about it was that it freed a lot of intellectual energy that could now be spent much more profitably on asking new interesting questions. Suddenly there was time to start asking questions about the way society was organized, the economy of society, because suddenly you didn't need to spend time on discussing dating, which has been the main occupation. So in a way, it was an intellectual revolution as well. And my take on it is that the third science revolution will do the same. We have now for more than 100 years been discussing migrations. Did people move or did ideas move? And we have never been able to really give a safe answer. Now we have safe answers. Again, it frees a lot of new intellectual energy. Now we can start asking interesting questions like, why did people move? How did they move? And what happened when they settled after movement? So in a way, again, it's also an intellectual revolution. But we're only starting. Actually, archaeology has in a way been taking the back seat because the genetic revolution has really been moving forward at high speed. We are some who have been fortunate to be on that racing horse from the very beginning. I've been working with Eske Willerslev and his team since 2010. So we have been working together all the way along. But most of the archaeologists has been taken by surprise. So in a way, archaeology took the back seat, but they're on their way up to the front wheel. And so what I'll talk about today is really migrations, because migrations are back. For 50 years, the gospel was in archaeology, no, people didn't really move. They may have moved out of Africa, yes. They had to spread over the globe, but then they started to settle. Agriculture, maybe there was some movement, but after agriculture, then. And so what I'll talk about today is really migrations, because migrations are back. For 50 years, the gospel was in archaeology, no, people didn't really move. They may have moved out of Africa, yes. They had to spread over the globe, but then they may have moved out of Africa, yes. They had to spread over the globe, but then they started to settle. Agriculture, maybe there was some movement, but after agriculture, then everything was quiet. And people were like in modern welfare societies, you know, they would exchange ideas about this and that, but people would stay put. How wrong we were.